the Muslim call to prayer, something that would have been heard daily in much of Spain from the 8th to 14th centuries. The common academic's view of Moorish Spain is called convivencia, a word used for living together peacefully. But how peaceful really was Moorish Spain? Modern academics glow about the tolerance of the Moors towards Christians and Jews. Are we to really view this as some sort of medieval utopia? Were the Muslims of Al-Andalus really so tolerant? This documentary makes no attempt to apologize for the horrible acts done under the Catholics in Spain, as that record has been made abundantly clear and may be overstated. But that is another conversation for another in my series. The focus of this documentary is to discuss the myths and realities of the Andalusian paradise in this episode of History Reclaimed. Spain has been home to Celts, Phoenicians, Byzantines, Iberians, Greeks, Jews, Carthaginians, Romans, Vandals, Visigoths, Muslims, and finally Spaniards. Our focus today is on the Moorish period of the 8th to 15th centuries. We will also review the Reconquista and the myths and complexities regarding that period. We will refer back to the Romans and Visigoths frequently, as their culture and technologies are tied directly to the history of the Moors. You could break the Moorish period into 4 stages: the Umayyad period, the Taifa period, Almoravid period, Almohad period, and the Reconquista. When the Umayyads, under Abd al-Rahman I, took control of southern Spain, he had to spend a decade of combat and rival fighting to seal his position as the first emir. Rahman named the land Al-Andalus. Southern Spain was only referred to as Iberia before the Carthaginian period of Spain. Under Rome, it was later known as Hispania. But even under the Muslims, it was still called primarily de España, and not primarily Al-Andalus. Prior to the invasion of the Moors, Christian Visigoths loosely ruled Spain in small kingdoms. Their capital was in Cordoba. In the 7th century, Christian Visigothic Spain was undergoing a renaissance in architecture, art, and church building. When the Visigothic kingdom collapsed under King Rodrigo, many cities could not put up any defense against the Umayyads. The Umayyads quickly destroyed much of Visigothic cultures. Churches and art with figures and books were put to the torch. But the Umayyads incorporated or inherited much of the Roman and Visigothic technology and architecture and building materials for their mosques and buildings. Hi, we're here in Toledo, and we're here at the Mezquita de la Santa Cruz, which is now a church, but formerly it was a mosque. It's one of the oldest structures, mosque structures that exist, this one dating back to the 10th century. When the Moors arrived here in Spain, led by Abd al-Rahman I, they faced little resistance in most of the towns they went into. That's because the Visigothic king, King Rodrigo, met the Moors in battle and lost. So when they got to most of the cities, they were forced in surrender. Most of the Christians and Jews were forced to surrender. And they're forced to surrender because they really didn't have any way to oppose the Moors at this point. So the academic idea of convivencia is really false. It's really they were forced into servitude. They were forced to surrender because if you didn't surrender, the males would be beheaded and all your women would be sold into slavery, many as sex slaves. The Moors seemed to excel at medicine, math, philosophy, combat, violence, slavery, and adapting existing conquered technology to their own uses. Their culture was a theocracy, ruled by a caliph and his ulama, religious rulers. This meant strict rules and moral codes enforced as law in their society. Muslim women in España had few rights. Music and images of people or animals were heresy to the Muslims. Music was still played by various courts in spite of their illegality. What might appear as convivencia is really just Jews and Christians being forced into servitude and reduced to the status to the Muslims. Men who did not submit were beheaded or crucified, and women were sold as sex slaves. Millions of white women were enslaved under Moorish Spain. Behind me is the first documented post-medieval European slave market dated back to 1444 in Lagos. Although Christians are associated with doing a great deal of slavery, the playbook was written by the Moors. Under Moorish rule, Jews and Christians and non-Muslims were dhimmis, meaning under the protection, and paid a tax, the jizya. Think of it like mafia protection money. What appears to be tolerance is really only submission. Dhimmis were very limited on their activities. For example, Jewish and Christian buildings had to be shorter and less ornate than mosques. No public displays or professions of faith for non-Muslims were allowed. There was no bell ringing. Only Muslims could ride horses. Dhimmis could ride mules or walk. In many places, Jews had to wear yellow armbands. Dhimmis could never be in a position of authority over a Muslim. There was no preaching or criticizing of Islam. Jews and Christian men could not take Muslim wives, but Muslim men could marry any woman as long as all her children were raised as Muslims. Jews and Christians were able to hold some higher officers under Muslim oversight, and these were called viziers. But it did not mean equality. They were allowing Jews this boon as a political counter against the more numerous Christians, not because the Muslims liked Jews. So we're at the Sinagoga de Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo. Notice this doesn't really look like a synagogue very much, does it? It looks like a mosque. Well, the Jews and Christians emulated the style of the Moors and used the mudahars after the Reconquista to build their synagogues and their churches and palaces because they enjoyed that style. But this style actually dates back to the Visigoths and maybe even to the Romans. So it really wasn't necessarily invented by the Moors. What was life for a Jew in this convivencia that the academics tell you under Moorish Spain? Well, what it meant is you're not an equal. Jews and Christians could not associate with Moors. They could do business with them. They couldn't live near them. They couldn't use the same wells. They couldn't use the same utensils. They couldn't eat from the same dishes. And life being a Christian under Muslim Spain wasn't really much different than Jews. You were under pretty much the same restrictions as the Jews were. It also is worth noting that mostly Jewish and Christian women did a lot of the farm labor work, while the Muslim women usually had to stay indoors. Okay, so here we are back in the cloister of the cathedral. This cathedral was actually the site of a Visigothic church, Christian church, which is a little different from the Catholic Church today. But this was the site of before the Moors came in the Visigothic church. After that, when the Moors came, they built a mosque here. And after the Reconquista, the church wanted to build a cathedral here. So they still practice a Visigothic Mass just like they used to in the 5th and 6th century today.
So, what was life like for women in Moorish Spain? If you were an honorable Muslim woman or Mushin, you would not be seen in public often. And if you were, it was with your husband or family male member, and they would be fully veiled and covered. White European women were most prized as sex slaves. Slaves in 912 sold for 200 silver for a black male, but a white female could fetch 1,000 gold dinars. A few of them sold as much as 14,000 dinars if they could also sing.
And because of the sheer number of Northern European slaves that were captured, the racial and cultural makeup shifted rapidly under the Moorish Empire as men took more Christian than Muslim wives. By the end of the Umayyad Empire in 1013, there were only 0.09% Arabic genetic makeup in the population. Surprisingly to most people, most caliphs were red or blonde-headed and had blue or green eyes, as many were sons of European slaves. So let's take a moment to just talk about technology in the Moorish times. It's really hard to believe that a bunch of primitive Berber tribes would have come over from North Africa and been able to build what they built so quickly. They basically reused the Visigothic and Roman technology that was already there. Aqueducts, facilities, cisterns, were primary locations for the Moors to build because they could reuse that technology. They took claims for building all those logistics to supply the cities, but it really was rebuilt with Visigothic and Roman technology and materiel. This is the site of the original Visigothic and Roman era fort. Not much of that remains. Why does it not remain? Because when the Moors came, they tore it all down and used it all for building materials. Roman and Visigothic structures. The original structure here under the Visigoths was St. Vincent's Church. The facade of the of this place is from the original St. Vincent's Church. So Moors did translate a lot of Greek philosophy and science and medicine, but Constantinople, before it fell, had already translated a lot of those works, and they were already spread throughout Europe. So the Moors did their own work and their own translations, and they're attributed that they saved Western Romano-Greek writings, culture, and science, and that is not completely true. The reason Medina al-Sahara was built here, one of the main reasons, is it already had access to a Roman aqueduct that was still working. So this idea that the Moors brought a lot of technology, they were really good at adopting and accepting the existing technology that was there. And water, of course, was critical. Notice here, this is part of the original Roman aqueduct. So what was the cause and decline and ultimate demise of the Moorish Empire in Spain? Well, the Umayyad Empire didn't last all that long before it declined into self-conflict and broke into small Taifa kingdoms. From there, more fundamentalist and more radical Muslims from northern Africa invaded under the Almoravids and the Almohads, and then the Reconquista came. So how did the Reconquista reconquer southern Spain from the Moors? Well, it's a complicated historical discussion outside the scope of this short documentary, but basically with the warring factions within the Moorish Empire, it presented an opportunity for the Reconquista Christians to take control of southern Spain again. It was a long process that took from the 11th to the 15th century. Toledo fell as early as 1085, Lisbon in 1147, Cordoba in 1236, Sevilla and Lagos in 1248, Ronda in 1485, Malaga in 1487, and ultimately Granada in 1492. So by the 13th century, the Reconquista had conquered most of Spain, and the only state left under the Moors was Granada. Isabel and Ferdinand expelled the last of the Muslims in the late 15th century, and the last Moorish king was Boabdil, who upon leaving Granada, he began to cry, and his mother said, "You cry like a woman who couldn't defend like a man." In the sake of fairness and objectivity, it is fair to state the Moors did advance the areas of medicine, mathematics, astrology, and their architecture and art were adopted into the Mudahar style well beyond the Reconquista. Whatever plus or minuses or myths of convivencia there are, this palace here in Granada, the Alhambra, is absolutely beautiful here. So, in conclusion, I'm going to quote Dr. Dario Fernandez Morera. In cultural terms alone, the invasion, conquest, and colonization of Christian Spain during the first half of the 8th century by Islamic warriors was a disaster for the Christian population because a nascent post-Roman Christian civilization was nipped in the bud. After the Muslim occupation in the 8th century, it took many years for Christian Spain to develop the greatness of its own medieval Christian culture, with its rich lyric and narrative poetry and its powerful Romanesque and Gothic architecture and sculpture. We're in the Moorish fort in Sintra, Portugal. Behind me you'll see the Peña Palace, built by a cousin of, in the 19th century, built by a cousin of Mad King Ludwig of Austria and Bavaria, who built his own famous castle. I find this a great spot for the analogy of this whole documentary. Fantasy castle there, reality here. I think the analogy goes that the whole idea of convivencia is actually a fantasy, and hopefully I've presented the facts to you objectively here and fairly, and you make up your own mind. For History Reclaimed, this is Jim Butler. Ciao.